full-size computers.
Deus Ex Mankind Divided is the latest entry in the Deus Ex franchise, and a sequel to Human Revolution. Like previous titles, it is a first-person RPG with a strong narrative, open non-linear levels, and a focus on player choice in how to approach and resolve objectives. While certain games have a more distant relation and association to their predecessor in gameplay, style, and just experience overall, somewhat as Human Revolution did to the original, this is certainly not the case here. Mankind Divided is a very direct sequel to Human Revolution, with a clear connection in everything from gameplay, level design, combat, music, dialogue, atmosphere, and of course story. To not notice the clear similarities, you'd probably have to be both blind and deaf. As such, I limit the time I spend on detailing the small differences between the games, since these differences are rather minor and primarily pertains to small tweaks or polish rather than any major changes. That's both because I don't think that would be particularly interesting, as well as I would find it rather tedious myself as well. And this isn't intended to be a count-up of all the small changes between the games either way. I will of course give a broad comparison between the two, and other than that, I will unsurprisingly mostly focus on what I find interesting, significant, useful, or important. Got all that? Great, let's continue. The game has a few issues when it comes to stability, and crashing, while not common, certainly do occur. Now, for those who don't know, it has to be said that crashing often isn't a universally encountered problem, and it won't necessarily be equally frequent on all hardware and software configurations. If the game crashes on consoles, that's one thing, and that's really bad. But for the most part, it will generally be the PC users that are most affected by the majority of problems, especially when it comes to game crashing technical issues. As a side note, when I say PC in reference to a personal computer, I do not necessarily only refer to a Windows in this case. This will also pertain to a Mac, Linux, or whatever you happen to have really. While a PC has several benefits in the way of customization, hardware capacity, modding availability, and quantity of games available, stability and compatibility is not one of them. There is a number of reasons for this, but it can be concisely summarized as being due to hardware variation and multiple operating systems. Needing to accommodate for these differences between machines is unsurprisingly harder than when you have a well-defined hardware and software specification for all users, which is the case for consoles. The only thing that will really vary between consoles is something like internet connection speed. Anyways, without trying to go too much off on a tangent here, it's understandable that making games work flawlessly on various PC configuration is harder than on a console. But while this is understandable, it is not an excuse. Ensuring that they work as well as possible for all systems and hardware variations that you sell the game for is part of the development and porting job. Selling dysfunctional products can't be considered acceptable just because it's difficult to make them work. You can think of essentially any other products outside of software and this would be considered entirely unacceptable. Due to the comparatively complicated task of making flawless software, however, a higher degree of leniency is usually and reasonably granted. But this certainly doesn't mean that I'll refrain from mentioning or calling it out. In the case of Mankind Divided, most crashes are quite sporadic and difficult to pin down to a certain issue. There is one specific instance, which is when you enter a shooting range, where the issue seems to be the instantaneous transfer of your current inventory when entering the shooting range. You seem to be able to rather consistently get around this issue by manually dropping most of your items before you try to enter. Aside from this instance, the cause of the crashes seems to be generally undetermined, with various different advice to resolve it generally boiling down to try disabling or tweaking various functionalities and options and hope it works. I'm happy to say that the frequency of crashes subsided significantly in the latter half of the game, and it seems the majority of stability issues are quite front-loaded for whatever reason. If you manage to get through the first kind of chapter of the game, you'll likely find the frequency of crashing noticeably subside. And while I'm not happy with the fact that this is a problem, independent of which GPU or CPU it might affect, for me the game was good and interesting enough to endure that section of frustration. But I also happen to be a big fan of the Deus Ex series and games, which might be worth mentioning. I will also note that I didn't find anyone who seemed to be affected badly enough for the game to be unplayable, just unduly burdensome. But this isn't something I can guarantee either. In the end, this will be a decision for each to make for themselves. Essentially in regards to what degree of bullshit they are willing to potentially endure due to them being unlucky in rolling the dice on their system's compatibility with the game. I can't guarantee anything in either direction, but it appears most people can get through the initial section and complete the rest of the game with a comparatively greater degree of stability. Nevertheless, consider yourself duly warned in regards to the issues you may encounter. The gameplay of Mankind Divided is incredibly similar to that of Human Revolution, albeit slightly updated. It is a FPS game with decent stealth and gunplay gameplay, interactive dialogue with multi-choice options, and a mix of open and non-linear levels that strongly emphasize choice of approach. You also have a RPG-style upgrade system in the way of augmentations, both passive and active. Active augmentations are essentially equivalent to spell abilities, and they tend to require battery charge, which essentially serves as an equivalent to mana. As you might expect, almost all augmentations you obtained during the previous game get charitably taken away early on in the game, which I mean is entirely to be expected. Otherwise, the required power scaling and awkward roundabout way the game would have to be constructed would be rather ridiculous. But worry not, it would appear that the developers realized that arbitrarily removing all abilities that the players acquired during the previous game would drive half the player base borderline homicidal. So they decided to add a number of new avant-garde abilities to subdue the masses, which was a decidedly good, advisable, and appropriate decision all around. So this gives us a few new abilities to play with as well. Several of the guns from the previous game make an reappearance here, albeit they are updated and feel quite different. But there are also a number of new and different guns that didn't exist in the previous one. These do for the most part act as a replacement for the weapon that previously existed in the given weapon category, which is good because, you know, I want to shoot with new guns, damn it. With that said, there is a bit more nuance to be had here. One aspect is progression or variance from one game to another in graphics and gameplay, where a gun almost looks and feels like a different weapon either way. Another thing I tend to value is of course the overall care, time and effort that has gone into each gun. If you have unique and interesting weapons where time and consideration clearly has been given to their creation, I find it a hell of a lot more acceptable, reasonable and justifiable than the 15th game with a M9 and AK-47. Nevertheless, back on topic. Mankind Divided does have quite interesting and unique guns, they do feel pretty good to shoot, and they feel noticeably different from Human Revolution if still aesthetically similar. So I'm still decidedly satisfied, especially since Deus Ex isn't a FPS combat-focused game at its core, even though this certainly is an important aspect of the game. So I'm relatively happy with the weapons that's available. During this little monologue about guns, I have also showcased the different guns that exist in the game, and also added a little comparison to Human Revolution for guns that are available in both games, just for reference and fun. The hacking minigame is back as well, essentially the same as it was in the previous game, The most marked difference there is really just the visual presentation. There is also another little something that I'll have to remark on, since it's not something I'm particularly fond of, even though I still understand the reason for the method of implementation for theoretical and practical purposes. And that is the battery-consuming animated takedown system. For those who don't know, in Human Revolution they introduced a system for all melee takedowns in the game, which now require energy to perform and play a canned animation on execution. Now, I don't like this. It's annoying, doesn't really feel that dynamic, and somewhat breaks the game flow. With that said, I do understand the reason for why they work as they do. It's obviously a balancing measurement to counter the efficiency of takedowns by making them consume energy, forcing you to either use energy consumables or wait for the battery to recharge. So it's a cooldown or recharge time for the takedowns, which means that you will have to use them in a slower, more considered way, or use other methods. Making them a more elaborate animation also helps to justify the consumption of energy. Since if all you did was stab your blade forward with an in-game animation, the battery consumption would feel incredibly unjustified and arbitrarily enforced. So I don't really like it, I understand the reason for it, and I have learned to live with it, but I guess it's just sort of a pet peeve of mine. As a bit of a side note though, they did make away with the forced boss fights that were present in the previous game that basically nobody sensible liked, which is quite nice. Specifically forced in the sense of being forced to take on a full frontal assault in a combat arena, therefore not allowing for an opportunity to get around it or resolve it in a non-lethal way, which sort of majorly disadvantage anybody building a non-lethal build, but either way that's what they decided to do. Nevertheless, in Mankind Divided this is no longer a problem, since these types of boss fights are essentially no longer present. With really the sole exception being the final boss fight, which bear a certain resemblance to these kind of arena-based boss fight that you found in Human Revolution. It is however possible to take down this final boss with non-lethal weapons and applications, if perhaps somewhat annoying and bothersome to do so. Dialogue plays an important role in the game, just as it did in previous entries, both due to the game's narrative focus, but also in the way that gameplay is impacted by providing important information and alternative completion avenues. It is generally well written and competently voice acted.
I know you may not want to talk about what happened to your store.
I get where you're coming from, okay? But try to understand, Jensen. I'm a guy who likes to respect privacy, especially if the other person is someone who can kill me. Which is real good for you, actually. It goes both ways.
You're willing to ignore what happened?
I am trying to protect myself.
There are also conversations where right and wrong answers can be chosen when arguing and trying to convince different characters. And just like it was in Human Revolution, there are augmentations available to help you with this task, assuming the character isn't immune to the augmentation in question, which a few of them are. Mankind Divided has also introduced a weapon customization system that's rather similar to Crysis, as well as a little bit of a stat upgrade system for good measure. Here you can add more substantial things, such as for example a full automatic fire mode for a submachine gun, but more minor upgrades are available as well, such as damage or magazine capacity. The difference to Human Revolution is that these minor upgrades no longer use separate upgrade or enhancement kits. They are instead applied by using scrap metal or weapon parts. Either way, it's kinda neat, and I approve of this addition. Graphically, it adheres to the aesthetics of Human Revolution. It retains the amber-tinted visuals of its predecessor, albeit a bit more tuned down and subtle, especially in regards to the in-game world, but for the UI, menus and interactive electronics as well. If you like the visuals of Human Revolution, you'd probably appreciate the visuals of this one as well. If you just found it somewhat overbearing, this might be a better balance for you. But if you outright hated it, this likely won't change your mind. I'm rather fond of it myself though, and I tend to like it when games look different, stand out and have a distinct visual identity, which these two recent Deus Ex entries has, which is good. But that's obviously a personal preference. Okay, let's continue. The world and level design in Deus Ex is irrevocably interconnected with the multi-choice gameplay Deus Ex offers and is known for. The original Deus Ex did, especially for its time, distinctly stand out for its open, non-linear levels. It presented the player with an undirected and openly structured environment which allowed them to figure out and choose their preferred way to approach many objectives. This non-linearity was, while maintained to a degree, somewhat scaled back and more directed in Human Revolution. Mankind Divided seemed to strike a bit of a middle ground between that of Human Revolution and the original. Being more directed than the original, but more open than Human Revolution. I would say its level design lay closer to that of Human Revolution as opposed to the first game, but this does admittedly draw from memory, and it was a while ago I played that game. Oh wait, no, actually it wasn't. I happened to revisit the game right before this review just for reference. And I'd say I hold on to that assertion. To perhaps elaborate somewhat, I'd suggest that Mankind Divided tends to work more with the vertical dimension when compared to Human Revolution, which has a, on average, somewhat flatter level structure. It's also a little bit more interconnected, more maze-like in structure. Albeit this difference is rather minor and primarily pertains to the main city hub. At least from what I can tell, but this is just a general perception. I have not made a one-to-one analysis of the levels. It may also have to do with that Mankind Divided has a slightly larger main city hub, while Human Revolution had several, which naturally can make it somewhat more complex to navigate. Now, this is obviously a subject that has substantial room for lengthy elaborations, but let's try to move on at this point. And nevertheless, it is fair to say that the difference between Mankind Divided and Human Revolution is rather subtle. Perhaps more so than I thought initially. Either way, moving on. The levels of Deus Ex tends to make a considerable use of alternate pathways, often by use of vents, ducts, boxes, ledges, destructible walls, hackable or, if keys or codes are acquired, unlockable keypads and doors, turrets, cameras, and sometimes more unique things like lifts or underwater pathways. Several of these alternate pathways are gated by skill checks, such as hacking or strength level. They can occasionally also be bypassed by equipment, however. It is quite a bit. The nonlinear level designs is, as mentioned, one of the most distinguishing aspects of Deus Ex. Unsurprisingly so. It can and is rightfully praised as being somewhere between pretty damn great and stellar, depending on which game we speak. Despite my general hesitancy for definitive determinations, this honestly isn't something I see myself changing my mind on. I am pretty decided. It also follows the general world structure of Human Revolution with some minor differences. It still makes use of hub areas, one in this case being the main city, which serves as both an avenue for connecting the various missions as well as the quest area for a number of tasks and objectives as well. Oh look, the previous game actually literally refers to these areas as hubs. Great! Now I feel vindicated in my nomenclature. Discounting Invisible War, because that's not a Deus Ex game, this same structure is present in all Deus Ex games. But Mankind Divided stands apart somewhat in really just having one such area, as well as one smaller kind of borderline hub, but not really. I mean, it barely even has any additional or optional side quests, which is a rather key aspect of a hub area. So I'm not so sure I'd even classify this as a hub area in the more conventional sense, in what they're supposed to be and what their purpose is, which essentially is to bind together different quests and side quests as well as quest areas, or mission areas, usually in the form of independent separate levels. So it's really kind of a borderline case, frankly. Either way, in the other games there were several obvious hub areas, while this one has maybe two, with one actual hub area and another one that's significantly smaller and barely counts as one. So the contrast between the games is still rather clear. The city is sectioned into two different parts of relatively equal size, but they are essentially just one big area separated by a loading screen. There is no real structurally justified reason as to why it couldn't be a single area in regards to the game's world. There is potentially other reasons, such as system architecture, performance, or creation process, but world consistency isn't one of them. This separation has little practical purpose and both areas are part of the same city. While this separation isn't a problem in any way, it is somewhat arbitrary and I don't count it as being separate hub areas. They are part of the same main hub. This results in the impression and feeling of a smaller and more contained game and story. Whether or not this is perceived as positive or negative will depend on personal taste. But it did make the game feel somewhat smaller and less grand in scope to me. Less epic and grandiose when compared with the more globalized conspiracy and adventure that it felt like it was in the previous games. The story here comes off as more localized and centered, with much of the narrative feeling more directly bound to the main city in Prague due to the fact that it is the central hub, in contrast to, for example, the first game, where we had not only several hub-like areas in Hong Kong, New York and Paris, but also levels taking place in a wide range of diverse areas. Interestingly, this is something that has kind of decreased with each game. The original Deus Ex had the largest amount of different and diverse locations. Thereafter we have Human Revolution, and last we have Mankind Divided. Since the story plays into this subject to such a large degree, I'll likely speak a bit more about this further on. In fact, I think this would be a good time to move on to that subject. Just as a quick preface, just on the off chance that the folks watching this may be interested in playing the games spoken about afterwards, I usually try to keep significant spoilers and plot reveals rather limited. Therefore, I don't do full narrative retellings, summaries and readouts. I don't tend to find it particularly useful, and the story tends to be better experienced through the medium of gameplay either way. At least if the story is even moderately adapted for the medium it actually appears in, which I certainly hope it would be. The story picks up after the events of Human Revolution. Thankfully, because it's a very good story. Continuing in the story of Adam Jensen as he takes the role as a Special Forces agent after he returns from what appears to be some kind of long-term sedation or coma-like status in a location he can't really remember himself.
Rescue crews pulled me out of the ocean and dumped me in a clinic in Alaska. Nobody knew who I was. For a long time, neither did I.
During this sleep-like status, it appears that he, unbeknownst to himself, had work done on his augmentations.
But you got some strange fucking augs back there. I mean, I probably shouldn't have.
As to why, what and how, well, that's what you're trying to figure out. Just as a heads up, you don't necessarily get a definitive answer to all the questions presented in the game, but if you're familiar with Deus Ex, this shouldn't come as a surprise. The other sort of core objective we have, which kind of binds into this one, but I won't go more into detail regarding that because I don't want to spoil things too much, concerns figuring out the motives of an anti-augmentation terrorist group, together with a significant amount of conspiratorial involvement and corruption coming from other actors and groups as well, of course. This is Deus Ex after all. The game does a good job at striking a balance between intrigue and mystery, as well as actual tangible objectives and threats that you actively pursue. The terrorist threat is distinctly more tangible and direct than the mystery regarding your disappearance and your augmentations, for example, even if they are tangibly interconnected. All questions and secrets won't be resolved by the end of the game, but do progressively unravel throughout the game and give you more information and context to what's going on, coalescing into what I would say is a sufficiently clear, if still somewhat mysterious resolution, with a balance between resolved and unresolved subplots. A lot of the game's story does, as mentioned, play out in the main city of the game, which, as I also previously mentioned, acts as both an open area of decent size for missions and side quests, as well as the sole hub area of the game. All the missions that you're sent on doesn't take place in Prague or the main city hub, but a large majority of them do. And many missions outside of the main city are still often located in Prague, even if it's not in the main city. Which means that compared to previous games, quite a lot of the story, as well as the playtime, does play out in or within a close vicinity of this city. The rest of the missions are located outside of the city and its close vicinity, which I think would amount to about 2 or 3 in this case, which, suffice to say, isn't that many. But there is, as mentioned, no other real city hub this time around. So that level type and the story connection and anchoring it tends to create is solely reserved for this main city in Prague this time around, which of course creates a somewhat different dynamic to their previous games. Even if the different levels obviously can vary somewhat in expanse content and how much they allow you to explore. This, combined with the fact that several questions remained unresolved or incompletely answered by the end of the game,
Find Orlov, Seraph. I've got questions I need answered.
Does make the story and game feel more contained and reeled in, almost like an interlude to what will happen in the next game and what happened in the previous one. Which, to be fair, I guess it could be considered to be in some regard, I guess. That the base of operations and focal point of the agency and therefore the story is rather strongly bound to the city where the local headquarters is located only helps to further reinforce this notion. This is, as mentioned, neither better or worse than the alternative, but it gives a slightly different notion to the experience and what's at focus. At the same time, however, the underlying story is actually quite grand, and very much does concern global matters which affects everyone. It's just that this more centralized game structure with a single main city hub that you keep coming back to time and again contorts this feeling somewhat and make it feel more locally confined and regionalized than it actually is in regards to the main plot. Why this city in Prague would hold such a centralized and important role and position in this story isn't really clarified or justified that well either, in my opinion, which makes the choice of this location feel somewhat arbitrary. It is interesting to see how level and game structure can impact perception despite the literal story though, I'll be honest. Now, as a last point, it does have a anti-discrimination type of allegory and message, which did exist in Human Revolution as well, of course, at least to some extent, but there the theme was more so related to the dangers of fast, unregulated scientific advancements, mixed with a supplemental critique of corporate greed and power, as opposed to discrimination.
You think governments can afford to let that go unregulated?
It can be somewhat overly obvious and blunt at points, honestly, which is unfortunate since it's always much more interesting when it's made in a subtle and clever way. Nevertheless, it's easy enough to overlook these instances where it is present, and I certainly didn't find it was overbearingly present to a degree where it hampered my enjoyment of the game to any meaningful extent. Dialogue in Deus Ex Mankind Divided is, as it was in previous Deus Ex entries, very important, which is why it gets its own segment. It's not just because of the large amount of story, lore and narrative the game features and the dialogue delivers, but also because it's an important and integrated feature of the gameplay. Speaking with the right person and convincing them to help you out can give you potentially useful information that impacts how you can approach different objectives, as well as sometimes potentially being a completion path in its own right. The voice acting in the game is solid and I find it to have a slightly higher consistency than that of Human Revolution.
That sting went to hell faster than the storm did.
You're welcome, but I don't think you came all this way to say thanks.
Director Miller asked me to get Agent McCready up to speed. Now I have the red-eye flight back to Oman.
I would not think this district has much to interest in Og, but I can't stop you from visiting.
They don't talk about it in those corporate brochures of yours, do they? Neuropathy dependency, rejection psychosis, any number of physical and psychological ills have resulted from this technology, and yet...
Listen, just because you have money doesn't make you better than me.
Which in turn was a big step forward compared to the dialogue featured in the first game, which, however charming you might have found it to be, wasn't particularly amazing.
Here you go.
God bless you.
The game features a dialogue system which is very similar to that of Human Revolution, featuring an augmentation upgrade which can help you convince the one you're speaking to through indicating the right choice of conversational approach depending on the target's personality profile. There are a few people in the game who are immune to this ability, in which case you'll have to figure out the appropriate approach for yourself. Which usually is how I prefer to play anyways, but that's just my preference.
Fuck me. We do not want trouble. There is no need to start any trouble, yes?
You sure you don't want to see anything else?
The sound design and music of the game holds a high bar when it comes to quality and consistency. It is very much reminiscent of that which we find in Human Revolution, both in the way of sonic texture and harmonic structure, at least from what I can tell and remember. But it is worth qualifying this with the fact that I am not a musician. The sound design is likewise also very similar to that of Human Revolution. A technologically evolved near-future soundscape and effects library well fitting for the thematic profile of the game.
Good morning, Adam. You have one new message.
Deus Ex Mankind Divided is, aside from being a quintessential example of a direct sequel and a good continuation of Human Revolution, also a very good and enjoyable game in its own right. Albeit due to its story having such a strong connection to the previous game, often being direct continuations of those preceding events, I believe the experience, especially in regards to the story, would be more enjoyable for those who have played and enjoyed the previous entry. The game keeps faithful to presenting a mix of clean technological evolution and advancement, with the same dubious and uncertain ethical framework that we saw in the previous game. Human technology, especially in the field of biotechnology and cybernetics, has clearly seen unrivaled advancements. Yet the unequal and corrupt society that we've seen throughout history endures. It presents its distinct and, in my opinion, very appealing mix of futuristic supremacy and cyberpunk depravity very well, together with a very rich body of lore and narrative that builds up the world you get to explore. In conjunction with this, it features a solid mixed approach FPS combat with open level design and multiple avenues of approach depending on preferred playstyle in essentially all situations, with different paths opening up depending on your augmentations and equipment. As a whole, Deus Ex Mankind Divided presents a very solid and competent first-person combat and narrative experience. This is accompanied by light RPG mechanics as well as a well-presented and rich world and story. If you played and enjoyed Human Revolution, I think you'll almost undoubtedly find it a satisfactory sequel, even if it might not answer quite as many questions as you would have ideally liked.
So what's on the scan?
Oh, that. I have no idea.
If you didn't like Human Revolution, you probably won't like this one. And even if you haven't played the previous games, I think it's likely that there will still be much for you to find and enjoy. And who knows, maybe it will inspire you to step back and try the previous entries. Albeit be warned that the mechanics of the first game are quite outdated at this point. Either way, however biased I might be due to my inherent predilection for Deus Ex, I can personally wholeheartedly recommend Mankind Divided. But whether or not it's a game that will fit you is obviously something that you will have to decide for yourself. Well, that is if you haven't already. Nevertheless, that's pretty much it for this time, so with nothing more to be said, farewell.